What is democracy? Today we primarily think of two different types of political regimes in the world, democracy and dictatorship. While there is debate as to whether regime type should be considered this binary variable, democracy versus dictatorship, or a continuous scale, with levels of democracy, scholars and philosophers have been defining what democracy is since ancient Greece. The meaning has evolved significantly since then, though, and this video is going to examine a few contemporary definitions of the idea. Specifically, I review procedural, values, and participation-based definitions of democracy. First, procedures. Robert Dahl, in his classic work Polyarchy, defines democracy along two dimensions, competition and participation. He argued that you could divide countries into categories based on how openly they allow people to compete for office, as well as how many people they allow to participate in that process. Elements of his definition are a bit out of date, but this two-dimensional view of democracy forms the foundation of how we think about the idea today, as well as the basis of the most common data used to measure democracy, a country's Polyarchy score. So let's break this down a bit. First, on competition. Holding elections is the minimum procedural standard for democracy, and all definitions of democracy emphasize that these elections must be free and fair. So just what free and fair is contentious, but generally this includes both an honest count of all eligible votes and a variety of civil liberties that ensure mainstream political views are allowed representation through elections. We generally categorize these under freedom of expression and freedom of association, but you can think of them more specifically as guarantees that more than one candidate is allowed to compete for office, candidates that represent different views are allowed to run for office, candidates are allowed to campaign without interference from the government, and candidates have equal access to media and public resources. These are relatively straightforward principles, but they're not always evenly applied in all democracies. For example, many people criticize the role of money in elections, arguing that it can provide an unfair advantage to some candidates and views. In addition, while all democracies feature free and fair competition, many democracies will limit the candidates and parties that can run for office or take seats in parliament. For example, Germany bans some extreme right-wing parties and requires that parties win 5% of the overall vote to win a seat in parliament. It adopted these policies to avoid a repetition of the conditions that allowed the Nazi Party to take power through elections in the 1920s. The second dimension of democracy is participation, which for Dahl meant suffrage. What percentage of the population has the right to vote? While this was an important element of the historical evolution of democracy, with most early, quote, democracies only adopting universal male suffrage between the 1850s and 1918, and they didn't adopt female suffrage until between, say, 1900 and 1950. Today, however, universal suffrage is considered a basic bare minimum, and even autocracies like Saudi Arabia allow women to vote in local elections. That said, restrictions on voter participation, ranging from taxes to intimidation, existed long after formal suffrage was granted and continue to limit democratic rights in a range of countries. So in established democracies, the fight to make elections more free, fair, and accessible continues. But what's important here is that even flawed democracies have competitive elections that can, and do, lead to the peaceful transition of power between different parties and different leaders. As more and more dictatorships hold elections, however, few people simply argue that elections in universal are sufficient to call a country a democracy. Even basic procedural definitions of democracy emphasize the need for elections to be accompanied by core political freedoms. This proliferation of elections has, however, also renewed efforts to define what is special about democracy, including the values that can support it. The study of civic culture, which goes back to de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, argues that elections both produce and require a certain type of culture, including values of tolerance and trust. Philippe Schmitter and Terry Lynn Carl, in their essay on what democracy is and isn't, define this concept more narrowly, focusing on the idea of bounded uncertainty. This idea that since today's winners may be tomorrow's losers, and vice versa, everyone agrees to abide by both the rules and the decisions of today's winners. Other definitions of democracy focus on different sets of values. One major distinction, for example, is between social democracy, which is best represented by the Scandinavian states, and liberal democracy, which is found in its purest form in the United States. While these also refer to economic systems, not just political systems, social democracies have larger states that provide more public services than liberal democracies. They also represent different attitudes towards government. Social democracies have a corporatist approach to state-society relations that resembles developmental states, while liberal democracies tend to have societies with less trust in the state. Finally, in response to voter disengagement with their representatives, some countries have experimented with what is called participatory democracy. These forms of democracy seek voter input on policy issues beyond just the electoral process. This can mean a country's use of referenda. This would be nationwide votes on major policy issues like new constitutions. More often, though, it means creating formal channels for civil society, that's non-governmental organizations, to provide input on things like local budgets and decision-making. I want to end in the same place that Schmitter and Karl do. What democracy is not. Schmitter and Karl conclude their essay by noting that democracy is not necessarily effective or efficient. It does not necessarily produce better policies than other forms of government. As Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. But for now, I just want to note that this is not always the way democracy is seen from the outside. Whether our definitions of democracy focus on procedures, rights, values, or participation, they all focus on politics. But from the outside, many people see democracy as just being more successful. For example, in the immediate aftermath of the pro-democracy protests of the Arab Spring, surveys found that majorities in several countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt define democracy not in political terms, but in economic terms. In a world where there is a strong correlation between countries that are democratic and countries that are rich, this isn't surprising, but it does highlight a central challenge of democratic transitions. Reducing economic inequality and providing public services may depend more on the strength of state institutions than the type of political regime a country has. But if democracies don't deliver on citizens' expectations, they may fail. So over these next few weeks, we will talk through the contrast between democracy and dictatorship, causes of transitions to and from democracy, and the economic impact of regime type. We'll tease out these relationships and their implications for public policy.